Captain Alexandra Hayes adjusted the strap of her dive gear as the early morning fog rolled across Naval Base Coronado, the Pacific stretching endlessly behind her like a living wall of steel-blue waves. She stood quietly, her figure composed and deliberate, while a group of Navy SEALs watched from a short distance with the casual arrogance of men convinced they had already measured her worth. The exercise today was not just about endurance or precision, it was about trust, about proving that she, a recently appointed captain in Naval Special Warfare, could lead Poseidon team under the most unforgiving circumstances. But the truth was that the eyes on her back were not only skeptical, they were waiting for her to fail. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper, commander of Spartan team, stood with his arms crossed, every inch of him radiating that easy Californian confidence born from years of successful missions and a reputation built on relentless results. He didn't hide his disdain for the idea that Hayes, despite her flawless record on paper and commendations earned in combat zones overseas, was now being positioned as a figure capable of matching or surpassing his team's record. To Cooper, the military was not the place for symbolism or experiments, it was about effectiveness, and his gut told him that Hayes was being given a stage she didn't deserve. Colonel James Harper had other ideas. From the command deck overlooking the pier, Harper's deep voice carried over the wind as he addressed both teams. The training operation was designed to simulate a hostile rescue at sea, complete with rough currents, disorienting fog, and timed objectives that demanded seamless cooperation. The Poseidon team, under Hayes, would be judged against the Spartan team, under Cooper, and every decision, every movement would be scrutinized. Harper had made it clear that failure was not an option, one team would earn commendation, the other would carry the weight of loss, and both knew that reputations lived or died in these simulations. Hayes didn't flinch under the stares or the subtle smirks. She had been here before, not at Coronado, not under the flag of her own nation's most elite unit, but in the moments of isolation where doubt pressed in like water crushing against the hull of a submarine. Her father, a decorated officer who had spent his career in the Navy, had once told her that leadership was not about commanding respect but about proving it in silence when no one wanted to believe in you. She carried those words with her now as she tightened her gloves, checked her oxygen supply, and nodded once to Chief Petty Officer Daniel Ortiz, her most trusted ally. Ortiz, solid and steady, gave her a look that said everything without words, "I'm with you, no matter how rough this gets." The teams entered the water in staggered formation, the Pacific immediately swallowing them in its cold embrace. Visibility was low, currents unpredictable, and the simulated wreck site marked by a half-submerged training vessel near the Channel Islands loomed ahead as a test of navigation and composure. Hayes signaled Poseidon team into a diamond formation, every movement precise, economical, drilled into muscle memory through months of relentless training. Cooper's Spartans, faster and more aggressive, cut across the waves with the confidence of men who knew the water as if it were their home. Harper watched the displays from command, monitoring heart rates, tracking progress, and recording every choice. The first phase was straightforward: infiltrate the wreck, locate the survivors, and extract them before a countdown clock expired. Yet almost immediately, Hayes sensed resistance not from the ocean, but from within. Two of her younger operators hesitated, glancing toward the Spartans as if unsure whether they were following the right leader. Doubt was contagious, and Cooper's shadow loomed large. Inside the wreck, the darkness pressed like a living thing. Hayes moved forward first, clearing corners with her weapon light, her breathing steady in her headset. Ortiz followed close behind, his bulk a reassuring presence. They found the dummies representing hostages bound near the engine room, and Hayes signaled extraction. But the challenge wasn't just about finding them, it was about getting them out through jagged steel corridors, currents pushing against them, oxygen ticking down. Cooper's team had entered from the opposite side, and by chance or perhaps by design they crossed paths in the flooded hallways. For a tense moment, masks reflected beams of light in the darkness, and it felt less like a training exercise than a real operation in contested waters. Cooper's eyes, sharp even behind his mask, lingered on Hayes with a look that said, "You're in over your head." Hayes didn't bite. She pushed her team forward, carving a path through debris and signaling with confidence that left no room for hesitation. Her every movement was measured, deliberate, and when one of her divers faltered, panicking as his fin snagged on twisted metal, she was the one who steadied him, cutting him free with a swift motion of her blade and pulling him back into formation. They surfaced 20 minutes later, dragging the survivors onto the waiting raft. Both teams finished within seconds of each other, and the debrief began immediately on shore. Cooper was the first to speak, his tone sharp but casual. He pointed out that Hayes's team had hesitated, that they had lacked the speed his Spartans demonstrated, and that in real combat, seconds could mean lives lost. Some of the younger SEALs nodded, and even Harper's stern face revealed nothing of his judgment. Hayes listened without interruption, her gaze steady. When she finally spoke, her voice carried not defensiveness but quiet conviction. She reminded them that success was not measured solely in speed but in resilience under pressure, in the ability to recover from mistakes without collapsing into chaos. She pointed out that her team had not lost a single survivor, despite obstacles, that discipline had been maintained, and that leadership meant more than charging ahead, it meant bringing everyone home. Silence followed, heavier than the Pacific mist rolling inland. Harper finally spoke, and his words cut through the tension like a blade. Both teams had succeeded, but Hayes had demonstrated something rare, the ability to lead under doubt, to steady the weak, and to bring order when disorder beckoned. Cooper's face was unreadable, but Hayes saw the flicker of something there, not respect yet, but recognition that she was not as fragile as he had hoped. That night, alone in her quarters, Hayes removed her gear piece by piece, the salt of the sea still clinging to her skin. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, at the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and reminded herself that this was only the beginning. The exercises would grow harder, the scrutiny harsher, and the storm that was coming would demand more than skill, it would demand everything she had. And though the weight pressed heavily against her chest, Alexandra Hayes felt the same resolve she had carried since childhood, when her father's voice had guided her through doubt: leadership is not given, it is taken. She intended to take it, no matter how many eyes waited for her to stumble. The next stage of the training began before dawn, the horizon still black except for the faint shimmer of city lights far across the bay. A biting wind blew in from the Pacific as Poseidon team and Spartan team assembled on the wet sand, their faces half hidden beneath camouflage paint, their gear stacked and ready for the long insertion ahead. Colonel James Harper stood on the edge of the surf with a clipboard in his hand, his presence as immovable as the tide. He laid out the scenario in clipped, precise words: a simulated rescue mission on one of the remote Channel Islands, where a group of hostages was being held by hostile forces in rugged terrain. Both teams would be deployed by helicopter into the ocean, swim ashore, navigate through hostile territory, and extract the hostages under timed conditions while evading patrols played by other operators. Success would depend not only on speed but also on stealth, decision-making, and the ability to adapt when the environment turned against them. The helicopters arrived just as the sun broke across the water, rotors thundering in the cold air. Hayes boarded with Poseidon team, her mind running through the mission's demands with the calm precision of someone who knew that nerves had no place in leadership. Cooper's Spartans loaded into the second bird, his voice carrying over the roar of the blades as he shouted final instructions with the same confidence that always seemed to rally his men. The two aircraft lifted almost simultaneously, slicing through the sky toward the drop zone. At 2,000 feet, the ramp opened, and the order came through their headsets. Hayes didn't hesitate. She led her team out into the open sky, the rush of wind tearing at her face as she plummeted toward the dark ocean below. The parachutes opened in sequence, blossoms of black against the fading night, and seconds later they cut into the freezing Pacific, swallowing the shock of impact with practiced control. Hayes surfaced first, scanning, counting every head. All accounted for. She gave the signal, and the team moved as one, fins driving them toward the distant outline of the island. Waves battered them, currents tried to pull them off course, but Poseidon team kept formation, Hayes at the point and Ortiz at her flank, a steady shadow in the churn of the water. On shore, the exercise shifted into its most dangerous phase. The island's terrain was steep, covered in scrub and jagged rocks, with cliffs that funneled sound and light in unpredictable ways. Hayes ordered silence, hand signals only, as they moved inland. Their target was an abandoned ranger station at the island center, where the hostages were supposedly held. But the exercise wasn't designed to be simple. Almost immediately, they encountered enemy patrols, other SEALs drafted for opposition forces moving with deliberate aggression. Hayes froze her team, reading the patterns, calculating angles. Cooper's Spartans, somewhere on the island's opposite side, would be pressing forward too, and she knew they would choose a faster, riskier route. That wasn't her way. Her team advanced in staggered bounds, using the terrain for cover, slipping between shadows as the sun climbed higher. When they reached a ridge overlooking the ranger station, Hayes crouched low, scanning through her scope. Figures moved below some guards, some hostages, indistinguishable at this distance. The simulation was designed to test judgment, storm the place with speed and risk losing hostages, or proceed with patience and risk being outrun by Cooper's Spartans. Hayes chose balance. She split the team, sending Ortiz with 3 men to circle west while she led the rest east. The plan was to converge, overwhelm the guards with controlled fire, and secure the hostages with minimal noise. Everything was unfolding smoothly until a flare shot up in the sky from the far ridge. The Spartans were already in play. Gunfire crackled through the canyon as Cooper's men stormed the compound from the north, their aggression a thunderclap against the quiet precision of Hayes's approach. Hayes clenched her jaw but didn't falter. She accelerated her advance, signaling Ortiz to breach from the flank as she pushed down the slope with her element. The compound erupted into chaos. Shouts, blank-fire rounds, smoke grenades, every detail crafted to mimic the confusion of real combat. Hayes burst through a side entrance, neutralizing targets with swift, efficient shots, her team fanning out behind her. Ortiz's group hit from the opposite side, boxing the defenders into a corner. Within minutes the hostages were secured, zip-tied actors playing their roles, eyes wide as if the fear were real. But Cooper's Spartans had already reached them, dragging 2 of the hostages toward the extraction point. For a tense moment, the 2 teams clashed in the cramped space, each claiming responsibility, voices sharp, tempers near boiling. Hayes held her ground, reminding Cooper that the mission was not just about grabbing bodies and running, it was about protecting all of them, moving as a unit, and ensuring no one was left behind. Harper's voice cut through the comms, cold and authoritative. Both teams were ordered to exfil together. There would be no solo glory. Hayes swallowed her frustration, regrouped her men, and together with the Spartans, they began the long trek toward the southern beach where extraction awaited. The island was not finished with them. Clouds rolled in fast, the wind rising, carrying with it the sharp bite of an incoming storm. By the time they reached the beach, waves had swelled to punishing heights, and the helicopters were grounded. Harper's voice relayed the new directive: they would have to hold position until the weather cleared, maintaining control of the hostages in hostile territory without support. Hayes immediately took charge, identifying the old lighthouse on the island's bluff as a defensible shelter. She ordered both teams to move, despite Cooper's scowl and muttered complaints. They scaled the cliffs under driving rain, the lighthouse looming against flashes of lightning, its windows shattered, its frame creaking with the weight of years. Inside, the team set perimeter defenses, rationed supplies, and prepared for a long wait. Tension filled the cramped rooms, the sound of rain hammering the glass, the smell of salt and rust in the air. Spartans and Poseidons eyed each other with open rivalry, each convinced their approach had been the right one. Hayes ignored the noise. She moved through the lighthouse, checking positions, speaking quietly to those on the edge of panic, offering calm where chaos threatened to creep in. Ortiz shadowed her, his presence a constant anchor, while Cooper brooded near the entrance, restless and impatient. Hours passed, the storm unrelenting, and fatigue gnawed at every man. Hayes felt the weight in her bones, the chill in her blood, but she refused to yield to it. She knew Harper was watching, judging not just tactics but the invisible qualities that define true leadership. In the middle of the night, as the wind screamed and the beams of the lighthouse swayed, one of the younger operators broke. He muttered that the mission was cursed, that they should have followed Cooper's lead, that Hayes was dragging them down. The words rippled through the room like poison. Hayes stepped forward, her voice steady but sharp, cutting through the storm. She reminded them that fear was the weapon of the enemy, that doubt was a luxury they could not afford, and that leadership meant standing firm when the walls closed in. She told them that survival was not given to the fastest or the strongest, but to those who endured together. Her words settled over the men, not with fire but with weight, anchoring them back to focus. Even Cooper, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, said nothing. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the island raw and glistening under pale light. The helicopters returned, blades chopping the damp air, and the teams moved the hostages down the cliffs for extraction. As they lifted off, the island shrinking below them, Hayes allowed herself a single moment of release, her shoulders loosening, her breath steadying. She knew the exercise was only one step in a larger crucible, but she had proven something not only to Harper, not only to Cooper, but to herself. She could carry the weight. And when the true storm came, she would be ready. The days after the Channel Islands operation were heavy with silence and unspoken rivalry. Back at Coronado, the air smelled of salt and jet fuel, the ocean crashing endlessly against the shore as if trying to drown out the tension simmering between Poseidon team and Spartan team. Colonel James Harper wasted no time. He gathered both units in the command hall, the walls lined with flags and plaques of past victories, and laid out the next phase of training. This one would separate the good from the exceptional, he warned, and there would be no hiding behind excuses. The exercise would simulate an assault on an offshore oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico, captured by insurgents. Hostages would be held in multiple levels of the rig, explosives planted to deter rescue, and time running out before detonation. Both teams would deploy simultaneously by submarine insertion, ascend undetected, neutralize threats, disarm charges, and extract the hostages. Harper's tone was cold as steel. In real life, failure here meant disaster measured not in losses of soldiers but in civilian lives and international fallout. Hayes listened intently, her posture straight, her hands folded behind her back. Every detail etched itself into her mind: the currents, the schematics of the rig, the timing of enemy patrols. She knew Cooper was listening too, though his expression was carved in that same mask of easy superiority, as if none of this fazed him. Ortiz caught her eye once during the briefing, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in the room filled with doubt. They boarded the submarine at dusk 2 days later, the metallic scent of oil and machinery clinging to the air as hatches sealed and the vessel slipped beneath the waves. The ocean closed over them like a tomb, darkness stretching in every direction. Hayes sat with her team in the cramped bay, checking gear, ensuring every weapon was clean, every oxygen tank full, every man steady. The rhythmic hum of the engines was broken only by Cooper's low jokes to his men, their laughter echoing with a confidence Hayes refused to acknowledge. When the order came, she was the first to rise, strapping on fins and mask, lowering herself into the freezing black. The water was colder than the Pacific had been, heavy with unseen currents, the silence pressing against her ears. Poseidon team slipped into formation, their lights dimmed, their movements as quiet as shadows. Ahead, the massive silhouette of the oil platform loomed, a steel monster rising from the depths, its lights flickering through mist like the eyes of some watching creature. Hayes led the ascent, heart steady, every sense sharpened to a razor's edge. Reaching the pilings, they began the climb, hands gripping cold, slick metal, waves crashing around them. Above, they could hear faint shouts, boots clanging against steel. The enemy was alert, but not prepared for what was coming. Hayes signaled. Her team spread out, taking separate ladders, rising into the underbelly of the platform. The assault began in silence. Knives and suppressed pistols took down the first guards, bodies lowered gently to the deck. Hayes moved like a phantom, every step calculated, every breath measured. Ortiz covered her flank, his eyes scanning every shadow. Deeper into the rig, gunfire erupted suddenly on the far side. Cooper's Spartans had breached, their presence loud and immediate, drawing the attention of defenders like a spark in dry brush. The rig shook with the echo of shots, shouts filling the metal corridors. Hayes clenched her jaw but pressed forward, using the distraction to slip her team deeper into the maze of pipes and catwalks. They reached the first group of hostages huddled in a storage room, their faces pale, their hands bound. Hayes cut them free, her voice calm and reassuring even in the din of chaos. Ortiz secured the perimeter, while two men guided the civilians toward the extraction point marked on their maps. The hardest part was still ahead, the charges. The enemy had wired explosives to the structural supports of the rig, set on a countdown timer. Disarming them required precision and nerves of steel. Hayes reached the control chamber, sweat beading beneath her mask as she crouched over the blinking devices. Her training kicked in, every wire, every circuit analyzed in split seconds. Her fingers worked steadily, cutting the sequence in the correct order, Ortiz's presence behind her like a wall against the storm. The timer stopped at 0:14. She exhaled slowly, her hands steady despite the rush of adrenaline. On the opposite side of the platform, Cooper's men were in heavy contact. Hayes could hear the reports over comm. Spartans pinned down, outnumbered, hostages still unsecured. For a moment she considered letting them burn under their own arrogance, but leadership wasn't about rivalry. It was about responsibility. She ordered Poseidon team to flank. They moved swiftly, cutting across catwalks slick with rain, bullets whining past their heads. Hayes fired in controlled bursts, dropping enemies with precision. Ortiz threw a flashbang, the explosion tearing light into the dark, stunning the defenders long enough for both teams to surge forward. Together, they cleared the room, freed the remaining hostages, and pushed back toward extraction. The rig was alive with fire and smoke, alarms blaring, the storm above whipping waves into fury. Helicopters hovered, their cables swinging down, rotors chopping through the chaos. Hayes guided civilians first, one by one, strapping them to harnesses and watching them vanish into the storm-lashed sky. Her men followed, Spartan and Poseidon shoulder to shoulder, indistinguishable in the maelstrom of survival. At the last, she turned to Cooper, who was hauling one of his injured men toward the rope. Their eyes locked briefly, no words exchanged, but something shifted in his gaze. Not respect yet, but acknowledgement, the first fracture in his wall of disdain. Hayes secured Ortiz and then herself, the cable jerking as the helicopter lifted, the platform below shrinking into fire and shadow. The debrief was brutal. Harper's expression was unreadable as he paced before the assembled teams. He recited the failures first. Spartan team had drawn too much attention, nearly jeopardizing the mission. Poseidon team had hesitated in communication, nearly leaving civilians vulnerable. Then he spoke of the successes, the charges disarmed with seconds to spare, all hostages recovered, casualties simulated but minimized. He said both teams had passed, but not flawlessly, and he would expect more next time. Cooper stood rigid, his jaw tight, his pride stung. Hayes stood still, her eyes forward, her expression calm. Inside, though, her blood still raced with the memory of the rig, the chaos, the moment she had almost chosen to let Cooper drown in his own recklessness. She had not, and that choice mattered. It mattered more than Harper's cold words, more than the nods of the other men. In the quiet of her quarters that night, as the base settled into uneasy rest, Hayes stared at the Pacific rolling under the moonlight. She thought of her father's words again, of the weight of command, of the truth that leadership was not about proving yourself to others but proving yourself to the standard you set when no one is watching. And she knew, with a clarity that cut like glass, that the storm ahead would demand more than she had ever given. The exercises were only the beginning. Somewhere out there, beyond the safety of training, a real crisis waited, and when it came, she would not face it with rivalry in her heart but with the unshakable resolve that had carried her this far. The oil platform operation lingered in every man's mind long after the helicopters had landed and the gear had been stowed away. At Coronado, the air grew tense as if the base itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened, the near disaster, the last-second triumph, the unspoken rivalry still simmering between Poseidon team and Spartan team. Colonel Harper didn't allow time for rest. Within days, he announced the next phase of evaluation, and the news spread through the barracks like a spark through dry grass, a long-range endurance mission that would push both teams past the point of exhaustion, testing not just tactical skill but physical resilience, mental toughness, and the ability to lead when every nerve was screaming to quit. It was a crucible designed to strip men down to their rawest selves and see what was left standing. The setting was brutal. Instead of the familiar coasts of California, the operation would take them north into the Alaskan wilderness, where icy seas and unforgiving terrain would be their constant companions. The mission was simple in words but monstrous in execution: insert by air into a remote coastal zone, trek across miles of frozen terrain with limited supplies, conduct a simulated raid on an enemy compound hidden in the mountains, and then exfiltrate under pursuit. Weather, fatigue, and the sheer desolation of the land would be the true enemy. Hayes prepared her team with a quiet, relentless intensity. She drilled them on cold-weather survival, on navigation through whiteout conditions, on the discipline required to move as one even when every muscle begged for rest. Ortiz was at her side always, his steady voice and grounded presence anchoring the men when the doubts began to creep in. She knew this mission would not be about flashy victories or quick assaults, it would be about who could endure. Cooper, by contrast, seemed almost eager for the challenge. His Spartans thrived on pushing themselves to the breaking point, their pride rooted in being the toughest, the fastest, the loudest. He boasted that the cold would weed out the weak, that only warriors who embraced the pain would survive. Hayes heard his words and let them pass. She had no need to match his bravado, she only needed to prove, once again, that leadership was forged in the quiet moments when no one else believed. The insertion began under a gray Alaskan sky, the roar of the aircraft swallowed quickly by the vast silence of snow-covered mountains and endless forests. The cold was immediate, sharp as glass against their skin, the wind slicing through gear and biting deep into bone. Hayes hit the ground in a controlled roll, rising to her feet and scanning the frozen expanse. Her team formed up quickly, eyes already narrowed against the sting of icy air. The trek began. For hours they moved across uneven terrain, snow crunching beneath their boots, breath pluming in the freezing air. The land was merciless. Hills rose like walls, rivers lay hidden beneath fragile sheets of ice, and every step seemed to demand twice the energy it should. Hayes kept them moving in measured pace, conserving strength, rotating point men to spread the burden, forcing breaks not when she was tired but when she sensed the weakest among them needed it. She knew that endurance wasn't about pushing until collapse, it was about never letting collapse come. Cooper's Spartans took a different approach. From a ridge in the distance, Hayes could see them driving forward with reckless speed, their formation wide, their pace punishing. They covered ground fast, but at the cost of energy that would not easily be replaced. Hayes said nothing, but Ortiz gave her a look that spoke volumes. They would burn themselves out long before the mission's end. The first night brought a storm. Snow fell in thick sheets, the wind howling through the pines, turning the world into a white void. Hayes ordered shelters built, guiding her men through the process of digging snow trenches, erecting makeshift covers, and conserving body heat in pairs. She moved from one position to another, checking every man, tightening tarps, adjusting placements, never allowing the storm to steal her focus. Cooper's team, she later learned, had pushed forward into the night, their shelters hurried and shallow, their bodies battered by wind and cold. Pride was a poor blanket. The raid on the enemy compound came 2 days later, after miles of frozen ridges and valleys had drained the men of strength and left them running on instinct. The compound, an old mining station repurposed into a mock enemy base, lay tucked between cliffs, its perimeter patrolled by opposition forces brought in to test them. Hayes studied the terrain carefully, her eyes narrowing as she traced every approach, every shadow, every angle of cover. She split Poseidon team into 2 elements, one led by Ortiz, the other by herself, converging in a pincer movement designed for precision rather than speed. They struck like the cold itself, silent, sudden, cutting through the defenders with swift efficiency. Hayes led her element through the southern gate, her shots controlled, her men moving in tight synchronization. Ortiz breached from the east, overwhelming the guards with coordinated fire. Within minutes the compound was theirs, the intel secured, the objective complete. It was a flawless operation, but it was not the end. The exfiltration was designed to be the true test. Opposition forces surged behind them, hunting them through the wilderness, forcing the teams to retreat under pressure. Hayes kept her men steady, her commands calm even as bullets cracked through the trees and snow sprayed from near misses. She guided them not along the fastest path but along the safest, using terrain to break line of sight, conserving ammunition, keeping discipline intact. It was here that the cracks in the Spartans showed. Exhausted from their relentless pace, frostbitten from their poor shelters, they faltered. One man collapsed, another limped with frozen joints, and Cooper himself was forced to slow his relentless drive. Hayes saw it, and for a fleeting second, she considered leaving them to their own pride. But she didn't. Leadership wasn't about watching others fall, it was about pulling them up when no one else would. She ordered Ortiz to cover their flank and doubled back with 2 men, hauling the Spartan who had collapsed onto their shoulders. Cooper's eyes met hers as she handed the man over, a mix of anger, humiliation, and something else flickering there, something dangerously close to gratitude. Together, battered and frozen, the 2 teams reached the extraction point where helicopters waited, rotors beating the snow into a storm of their own. The mission ended, but its echoes lingered. In the debrief, Harper's voice was even colder than the Alaskan wind. He acknowledged the success but spared no one from criticism. The Spartans had nearly broken under the weight of their own pride, the Poseidons had risked delay by doubling back, and both teams had demonstrated that rivalry still clouded their judgment. Yet he also noted, almost begrudgingly, that Hayes had shown a quality rare even among the elite, the ability to think beyond herself, beyond her team, to the larger picture. Cooper sat stone-faced, but Hayes saw the truth written in the hard set of his jaw. He could no longer dismiss her as unworthy, not after she had carried his man on her shoulders through the snow. That night, back at the barracks, Hayes lay awake staring at the ceiling, the sound of the ocean outside replaced in her mind by the howl of the Alaskan wind. Her muscles ached, her lungs still burned, but beneath the exhaustion there was clarity. She knew the exercises were approaching their end, that soon the evaluations would be over and real missions would come. And she knew that when they did, there would be no simulations, no safeties, no second chances. Somewhere, beyond the walls of Coronado, beyond the rhythm of training, the world waited with its real dangers and its real storms. And when that moment came, she would face it not with doubt, not with fear, but with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the cold. She would endure, because endurance was the only path to victory. The days following the Alaskan crucible were heavy with exhaustion and silence. At Coronado the teams walked with the stiff, deliberate movements of men whose muscles had been stretched past their limits, but beneath the fatigue lay something sharper, a shifting undercurrent that neither Poseidon nor Spartan could quite ignore. Harper had seen it during the debriefed, grudging respect forming between Hayes and Cooper, the unspoken recognition that despite all rivalry, each had proven a kind of leadership the other could no longer dismiss. Yet Harper was not done with them. The 5th phase of evaluation was designed not to test endurance or tactics, but loyalty, ethics, and the invisible fault lines that ran beneath even the strongest soldier's armor. It was a phase that could not be measured in miles marched or shots fired, but in choices made when the lines between duty and humanity blurred. The scenario was set in the Gulf of Mexico, where a derelict freighter drifting near international waters had been outfitted as the site of their next mission. The exercise was crafted to simulate a hostage crisis, armed opposition, unpredictable civilians, and intelligence that shifted with every passing moment. But Harper added a twist. Unbeknownst to the teams, embedded within the opposition were actors planted to sow confusion, to mimic the presence of civilians who might be collaborators, innocents who might be threats. It was, in essence, a moral labyrinth designed to force decisions under pressure, decisions that would reveal who these operators truly were when the veneer of certainty was stripped away. From the moment Hayes boarded the helicopter that carried Poseidon team over the shimmering Gulf, she felt the weight of this mission pressing differently than the others. The roar of the rotors couldn't drown out the thought that this was not about tactics, not real, it was about judgment, and judgment had no second chances. Ortiz leaned close, shouting over the noise, "You know they're going to try to break us from the inside this time." Hayes only nodded, eyes fixed on the endless water below. She knew he was right. The insertion was fast, ropes whipping as they slid down to the rusting deck of the freighter. The smell of salt and oil filled the air, the metal groaning beneath their boots. Gunfire cracked almost immediately as opposition forces engaged, and Hayes responded with sharp, efficient commands, her team moving like parts of a single machine. They swept corridors slick with seawater, cleared holds lit by swinging bulbs, each room bringing new uncertainties. Then came the first test. In a dimly lit storage bay, they found a woman crouched behind crates, her hands raised in trembling surrender. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, and she wept as though every moment might be her last. Hayes raised a hand, halting her men. Something in the scene was too neat, too perfectly arranged. Ortiz whispered, "Could be a plant. Could be wired." Hayes studied the woman's eyes wide, glassy, darting not with terror but with calculation. She ordered restraints applied, careful but firm, and moved on. Behind her, Ortiz gave a small nod. "Trust, but verify." Later, in the engine room, the opposite happened. A boy no older than 14 stumbled out from behind a turbine, coughing in the smoke. He carried nothing but a rag clenched in his fist. One of Hayes's men, hardened by the storm in Alaska, raised his rifle out of reflex, but Hayes stopped him with a sharp gesture. She knelt, pulling the boy close, and searched him quickly. No wires, no weapons, only the fear of being caught in something larger than himself. She handed him off to be escorted topside, her voice steady but low, "Protect him. He's not part of this." In that moment she knew she had chosen humanity, and that choice carried risk, but also truth. Across the freighter Cooper was making his own choices. The Spartans drove forward with their usual aggression, cutting through opposition with ruthless precision, but when confronted with civilians actors meant to confuse their responses were harsher. Cooper's instinct was to treat hesitation as weakness, his commands sharp and absolute. To him, the mission's success mattered above all else. He saw the civilians as variables to be controlled, restrained, or eliminated if necessary. Where Hayes sought to discern, Cooper sought to dominate. The clash came when the two teams converged near the bridge of the freighter. The opposition had staged their final defense there, a gauntlet of barricades and gunfire that forced both teams to fight side by side whether they liked it or not. The firefight was brutal, bullets sparking against steel, grenades shaking the rusted hull. Hayes led her team through the lower approach, clearing stairwells with methodical precision, while Cooper stormed the upper deck in a surge of force. The enemy collapsed under the dual assault, and soon the bridge was theirs. But inside, another test waited. Two men stood with their hands raised, unarmed, their faces marked with terror. One insisted he was a hostage, the other claimed to be a mechanic caught in the chaos. Yet both wore boots too new, uniforms too clean, details too sharp to escape a trained eye. Harper's planted actors, no doubt. Cooper moved first, shoving one man against the wall, barking orders, demanding answers. Hayes intervened, her tone calm but cutting, insisting they separate the two and verify. For minutes they argued, Hayes demanding caution, Cooper pressing for control until Harper's voice finally came through the comms, ending the scenario. The freighter fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading into the sound of the sea. Extraction came swiftly, helicopters whisking both teams back toward the mainland, but the true battle awaited in the debrief. Harper's eyes were cold as he addressed them in the briefing room. He recounted each decision, each hesitation, each moment where humanity and duty collided. He praised Hayes for her discernment, for choosing compassion without surrendering control, but he also warned her that compassion could become vulnerability. He acknowledged Cooper's decisiveness, his unflinching drive, but chastised him for blurring the line between threat and innocent, for letting force override judgment. Then he delivered the verdict both had dreaded and anticipated: war doesn't test your body, not really. It tests your soul. Some of you have proven you can endure pain. Some of you have proven you can endure doubt. But only those who can carry both and still make the right call are fit to lead. Silence followed, heavy as iron. Hayes felt every man in the room measuring his own soul against those words. Cooper's jaw clenched, his pride battered yet unbroken. Ortiz sat with his arms crossed, his loyalty to Hayes etched in every line of his face. For Hayes, the weight of Harper's judgment was not condemnation, but clarity. She knew now that these exercises were not about victory or failure, but about revelation. They revealed who she was, who Cooper was, who each of them became when stripped bare by the impossible. That night, alone in her quarters, Hayes stared out across the dark Pacific, the waves rolling endlessly under the moonlight. She thought of the woman in the storage bay, the boy in the engine room, the two men on the bridge. She thought of choices, of how each one left a mark that no debrief could erase. She whispered to herself, not as a vow but as a reminder, strength without judgment is nothing. Judgment without courage is nothing. But together they are everything. And in that quiet moment she understood, the true test was not behind her, nor even ahead of her in some future mission. It was constant, unending, woven into every breath she took as a leader. The test was life itself, and she would meet it with the only tools she had ever truly owned: her resolve, her humanity, and her unshakable will to endure. The sun at Coronado burned hotter as summer settled in, but the teams felt no warmth from it. The days had become a blur of drills, evaluations, and constant pressure, each phase hammering at their bodies and minds until it seemed there was nothing left to give. Yet Harper never stopped pressing, never stopped searching for the point where men or women would break. After the hostage scenario aboard the freighter, the teams thought perhaps the worst was behind them, but Harper proved them wrong. He announced the next trial not with ceremony but with the kind of offhand authority that carried more weight than any grand speech. Joint operation. Poseidon and Spartan, together. Failure for one is failure for both. His words fell like stone in water, sending ripples through every man and woman present. A joint mission meant not rivalry but cooperation, and cooperation meant trust. Trust, however, was the rarest currency between Hayes and Cooper's teams. The exercise was staged deep in the deserts of Arizona, where abandoned military installations dotted the landscape like ghosts of a different era. The objective: infiltrate a fortified compound representing a terrorist command hub, retrieve critical intelligence, and extract under simulated pursuit. The catch: the opposition would be relentless, their numbers overwhelming, the terrain merciless, and the mission impossible without unity. Hayes felt the weight of Harper's words more than anyone. She knew that Poseidon team's discipline and Cooper's raw aggression could be a devastating combination if aligned, but she also knew how fragile the alliance was. Ortiz voiced the doubts aloud as they flew over the endless stretches of sand. "You really think he'll take orders from you out there?" he asked, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses but his voice carrying quiet skepticism. Hayes answered without hesitation. "Doesn't matter. Out there we don't have the luxury of pride. He doesn't have to take orders from me. He just has to fight beside me." Ortiz grunted but said no more. The insertion came under a moonless sky, helicopters dropping both teams miles from the target compound. The desert air was dry and sharp, the sand crunching under their boots as they moved in staggered columns across the barren terrain. The stars above burned like cold fire, offering no comfort, only a reminder of the vastness surrounding them. Almost immediately the friction began. Cooper insisted on a direct route, a fast strike that would overwhelm the defenders with sheer aggression. Hayes countered with a plan that favored stealth, patience, and precision. Their whispered argument stretched for long minutes in the desert night, their men waiting in tense silence. Finally, Harper's voice crackled in their comms, sharp as a whip: "Decide. Now." Hayes exhaled and made the call. "We split the approach. Cooper takes the west flank, Poseidon moves east. We converge on the north wall. Synchronize at my mark." It was a compromise, not ideal, but better than paralysis. Cooper's silence was heavy, but he agreed. The assault began in silence, shadows moving against shadows as both teams crept closer to the compound. Hayes led her men along the eastern perimeter, slipping past sentries with ruthless efficiency, her commands barely more than gestures in the dark. Cooper's team, on the other hand, erupted in sudden violence along the west, their gunfire shattering the quiet night, their advance a storm that drew defenders like moths to flame. Hayes seized the opening, signaling her team to breach the north wall while the enemy was distracted. Explosives whispered then roared, the wall collapsing in dust and fire, and Poseidon surged through the breach with surgical precision. Inside the compound chaos reigned. Gunfire echoed off concrete walls, shouts mixed with screams, the air thick with smoke and dust. Hayes moved like a blade through the storm, her men covering angles with flawless discipline. She reached the command center, Ortiz at her side, and together they secured the intelligence hard drives, documents, encrypted devices. But the extraction was far from secure. Cooper's Spartans, though devastating in their assault, were pinned down on the west side, outnumbered and taking fire from elevated positions. Hayes heard it over the Comsty-clipped tone of Cooper ordering his men to hold, the strain in his voice as one Spartan cried out in pain. Without hesitation Hayes gave the order that would define the mission. Poseidon, pivot west. We're bringing them out. Ortiz didn't question, didn't hesitate. Together the two teams collided in the heart of the compound, Poseidon covering Spartan's retreat, Spartan providing the firepower to blast a path through. For the first time the rivalry melted away, replaced by the desperate unity of survival. Hayes found herself shoulder to shoulder with Cooper, their movements instinctively synchronized. Fired, she advanced, he covered, she cleared. The desert night lit up with tracers and explosions, but somehow, impossibly, they carved a way out. They reached the extraction zone battered but intact, the helicopters thundering in to carry them away. As the desert receded beneath them, Hayes looked across at Cooper. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes still burning with the adrenaline of the fight. For the first time there was no contempt there, no dismissal, only acknowledgement. He gave her a single nod, small but heavy with meaning. Harper's debrief was merciless, as always. He praised the unity forged under fire but condemned the initial division that nearly doomed the mission. You can't afford to be rivals in the field, he said, his voice sharp as broken glass. The enemy doesn't care about your egos. They care about your weaknesses. And right now, you're handing those weaknesses to them on a silver platter. The word struck deep, especially with Cooper. Hayes could see it in the way he avoided her gaze, in the tension in his shoulders. He was beginning to understand that his strength, unmatched though it was, could not carry a mission alone. That realization was more painful to him than any bullet wound. That night, in the barracks, Hayes sat with Ortiz, her voice low. We can't keep doing this, she said. We can't keep tearing at each other and expect to survive the real thing. Ortiz looked at her for a long moment before replying. Then maybe it's time to stop fighting him and start finding a way to fight with him. Hayes didn't answer, but the thought lingered in her mind long after the base fell quiet. Outside, the Pacific whispered against the shore, steady and endless, as if reminding her that the battles ahead would demand more than strength or endurance. They would demand unity, the kind forged not in words but in fire. And deep down she knew the fire was only just beginning. The weeks of evaluation had felt like years, each trial carving deeper into the hearts of Poseidon and Spartan alike, but Harper was not a man who let momentum fade. He understood that steel was not forged in a single flame but in repeated strikes, and he had one final strike prepared. This last exercise would not take place in the deserts or mountains or seas near home. Instead, Harper had arranged for their deployment to the Florida Keys, where an abandoned island research facility had been transformed into a mock enemy fortress. The scenario was the most complex yet, a joint infiltration under the cover of night, hostage rescue, sabotage of enemy equipment, and survival against overwhelming pursuit. Unlike previous phases, there would be no pause signal, no clean cutoff once the objective was reached. The simulation would end only when extraction was complete, no matter how long it took. It was designed to mimic combat at its rawest, chaotic, unending, merciless. On the flight out, Hayes sat in silence, her hands resting on her rifle, her thoughts steady but heavy. Ortiz leaned close, his voice pitched low against the thrum of the rotors. "This one feels different," he said. Hayes nodded. "Because it is. This isn't just a test anymore. This is Harper's way of asking one question: when the storm hits for real, will we break apart or hold together?" Across the helicopter, Cooper sat rigid, his men tense around him. He said nothing, but his eyes occasionally flicked to Hayes, and she could feel the unspoken truce that had begun to form between them since the desert. Respect was there now, raw and cautious, but real. Whether it would hold under fire remained to be seen. The insertion was brutal. High winds whipped the helicopters as they hovered over the island, ropes swinging wildly as the operators fast-roped down to the sandy clearing below. Immediately the smell of salt and damp vegetation filled the air, mingling with the distant roar of surf against rock. Hayes hit the ground hard, rolled, and rose to her feet, signaling her team into formation. The night pressed in heavy, humid and suffocating, every sound amplified by the stillness. They moved quickly through the jungle toward the facility, shadows gliding between palm trunks and rusting fences. The opposition was ready for them. Spotlights snapped on, gunfire tore through the night, and suddenly the jungle erupted in chaos. Hayes dropped to cover, issuing crisp commands. Poseidon moved with surgical precision, returning fire in controlled bursts, advancing yard by yard. On the other side, Cooper unleashed his Spartans like a hammer, driving forward with raw aggression, their assault shaking the defenders with sheer ferocity. For a moment Hayes thought the old friction would return, but then something shifted. The two teams, instead of colliding, began to complement one another. Spartan's fury drew fire, Poseidon's precision exploited openings. What had once been rivalry became rhythm, a cadence of destruction that carried them to the facility's gates. Inside the compound the mission fractured into pieces. Hayes led Poseidon toward the lab where the hostages were said to be held, while Cooper took Spartan to the communications tower to plant charges. The facility was a maze of corridors and rusting machinery, the air thick with dust and tension. In the basement lab Hayes found them, 3 hostages tied and blindfolded, guarded by a squad of defenders. With Ortiz at her side she orchestrated the breach with flawless timing, flashbangs exploding, rifles cracking, hostages pulled to safety within seconds. She checked each one quickly, ensuring they were stable, then called it in. Hostages secure. Moving to extraction. Across the compound Cooper's voice crackled over comms. Charges planted. Tower will be ash in 5. For a brief moment, Hayes allowed herself the thought that they might actually succeed cleanly, that the bitter lessons of the past weeks had forged something stronger than pride. But Harper had not designed this mission to end cleanly. The pursuit began almost immediately, waves of opposition flooding the facility, pressing from every angle. The extraction zone was nearly a mile away through dense jungle, and they would have to fight for every step. Hayes gathered her team, the hostages shielded in their midst, and linked up with Cooper near the shattered remains of the comms tower. For the first time they stood together not as rivals but as commanders sharing a single burden. "We move fast," Hayes said, her voice steady. "Spartan leads, Poseidon covers the hostages. Switch when needed." Cooper gave a sharp nod, no argument, no hesitation. And then they ran. The jungle exploded with fire and fury, tracers slicing through the night, grenades shaking the earth. Cooper roared commands, his Spartans firing with brutal efficiency, while Hayes moved along the column, her calm voice steadying nerves, her rifle cutting down threats before they reached the hostages. Ortiz was everywhere at once, a shield and sword, dragging men out of the line of fire, returning bursts of lead that carved space through the chaos. They pushed forward inch by inch, the extraction zone still impossibly far. Then came the moment Hayes had feared. One of the hostages stumbled, collapsing in the mud, too weak to continue. Bullets snapped past, men shouted, time burned away like dry paper. Hayes dropped beside the hostage, hauling him up, but the weight slowed her. Without a word Cooper appeared, seizing the man under one arm and dragging him forward with the strength of pure will. Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance the last remnants of rivalry dissolved. They were no longer Poseidon and Spartan. They were simply warriors carrying the same burden through hell. The extraction zone came into sight at last, a narrow clearing where helicopters thundered above, their rotors whipping the jungle into a storm of dust and leaves. But the enemy was relentless, pouring into the clearing in numbers too great to count. For a moment it seemed impossible, the weight of opposition too heavy, the distance too great. Hayes felt her heart hammer, the line between survival and annihilation razor thin. Then she raised her voice above the chaos, sharp and commanding. Push! Now! Cooper echoed her instantly, his roar amplifying her command. Together they drove the teams forward in a final surge, bullets screaming, men bleeding, but no one stopping. They crashed into the clearing, dragging hostages, carrying wounded, fighting with every last ounce of strength. The helicopter's guns roared, cutting down the final wave of opposition, and then the teams were inside, the doors slamming shut, the aircraft lifting into the night. Silence fell inside the helicopter, broken only by ragged breathing, the pounding of exhausted hearts. Hayes sat against the wall, sweat and blood streaking her face, the rescued hostages huddled close. Across from her Cooper sat slumped, his eyes locked on hers. No words passed between them, but none were needed. Respect had been earned not through lectures or pride but through fire. Back at Coronado the debrief was strangely brief. Harper stood before them, his expression unreadable, and simply said, "You've proven what needed proving. You've shown that strength without unity is nothing, and unity without strength is useless. Together, you are formidable. Together, you may just be ready." His words carried no praise, only acknowledgement, but to the exhausted operators it was enough. Later, when the barracks had gone quiet and the base lay under a blanket of night, Hayes stood alone by the shore. The Pacific stretched before her, endless and eternal, the moonlight dancing on its waves. Ortiz joined her after a while, silent at first, then saying softly, "Feels like it's only just beginning, doesn't it?" Hayes smiled faintly, her gaze never leaving the horizon. "Because it is. The real battles are still ahead. But we'll be ready." Behind them, in another corner of the base, Cooper stood watching, his thoughts his own. For the first time he no longer saw Hayes as competition to crush, but as a comrade who had walked through fire beside him. And in that unspoken shift lay the promise of something greater than either team alone, the birth of a force forged not by rivalry but by unity, ready for whatever storm the future would bring.